Hello, whispers in the dark viewers. In today's video, I will tell you our echoes of the unseen story. You may feel scared while listening to this story. If you are ready for horror and mystery, let's start. Jack Thompson sat hunched over the workbench in his dimly lit basement, surrounded by a maze of vintage radio equipment. Wires and tubes snaked across the cluttered surface, a testament to his lifelong fascination with the medium. Though he was a skeptic at heart, something had drawn him to this particular project. An old radio receiver he'd unearthed while cleaning out the storage room. With a critical eye, Jack examined the device, running his fingers along the weathered knobs and dials. "Let's see what you've got," he muttered, flipping the power switch. A faint hum filled the air as the tubes warmed up, and Jack began slowly sweeping the dial across the frequencies. Static crackled through the speakers, interrupted by the occasional burst of garbled voices. Jack frowned, adjusting the tuning knob with precision. He was about to give up when a strange series of numbers suddenly broke through the interference. 4, 8, 15, 16, 23, 42. Jack's brow furrowed as he leaned closer, straining to make out the disembodied voice. The numbers repeated over and over in a distorted, almost hypnotic cadence. A chill ran down his spine, and he found himself unable to tear his gaze away from the radio. "What the hell?" he murmured, his skepticism momentarily shaken. Just as he was about to adjust the dial again, the numbers abruptly cut off, replaced by a low, ominous hum. Jack sat back, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew he should turn the radio off, but something about the eerie transmission had piqued his curiosity. "Okay, let's see where this goes," he said, his voice betraying a hint of trepidation. Slowly, he began fine-tuning the receiver, searching for any other signs of life on the frequency. Static crackled, punctuated by the occasional burst of distorted sound, a garbled voice, a faint melody, the crackle of interference. Jack listened intently, his mind racing as he tried to make sense of what he was hearing. A sudden movement in the corner of his eye caused him to jump, and he whirled around to find Sarah standing in the doorway, a concerned expression on her face. "Jack, what are you doing down here?" she asked, her voice soft and gentle. Jack took a deep breath, trying to calm his nerves. I found this old radio receiver. I was just experimenting with it, that's all." Sarah stepped closer, her gaze drifting to the equipment on the workbench. "You know, you've been spending a lot of time down here lately. I'm starting to get worried about you." Jack waved a dismissive hand. "It's nothing, really. I'm just trying to figure out how this thing works. There's something strange about the frequencies it's picking up." Sarah's brow furrowed, and she placed a hand on his arm. "Strange how?" "Jack, you know I support your work, but this seems a little obsessive even for you." Jack sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know, Sarah. There's just something about these transmissions that's got me hooked. I can't explain it, but I feel like I'm on the verge of a breakthrough." Sarah's expression softened, and she pulled him into a gentle embrace. "I know you, Jack. When you get like this, it's hard to pull you away. But please, promise me you'll be careful. I don't want to see you getting lost in this. Whatever it is." Jack returned the hug, feeling a pang of guilt for worrying Sarah. "I promise," he murmured, his gaze drifting back to the radio. "I'll be careful." As Sarah left the basement, Jack turned his attention back to the receiver, his fingers once again finding the tuning knob. The static had returned, but this time, he could swear he heard a faint, distorted voice calling out his name. "Jack!" He froze, his heart racing. "Hello?" he called out, his voice barely above a whisper. The voice repeated his name, the tone sending a chill down his spine. Jack leaned in closer, straining to make out the words, but the transmission was too garbled to discern anything coherent. "Who are you?" he demanded, his skepticism slowly giving way to a growing sense of unease. The voice fell silent, replaced by a low, eerie hum that seemed to reverberate through the basement. Jack sat back, his hands trembling slightly. He knew he should turn the radio off, but something compelled him to keep listening, to unravel the mystery that had taken hold of his curiosity. As the hum faded, Jack heard the faint sound of static, followed by a new series of numbers, eerily familiar. 4, 8, 15, 16, 23, 42. Jack's breath caught in his throat, and he found himself once again transfixed by the transmission. The numbers repeated over and over, like a haunting mantra, and Jack felt a growing sense of dread wash over him. "What the hell is this?" he whispered, his mind racing to make sense of the bizarre broadcast. As the numbers continued to echo through the basement, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that the very air around him was charged with an unseen presence. He glanced nervously over his shoulder, half expecting to see a ghostly figure lurking in the shadows. The transmission suddenly cut off, plunging the basement into an uneasy silence. Jack sat motionless, his heart pounding in his ears, as he tried to process what had just occurred. "Sarah was right," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "This is not normal." Slowly, he reached for the power switch, his fingers hesitating for a moment before flipping it. The radio fell silent, and Jack let out a long, shaky breath. "What the hell have I gotten myself into?" Jack's basement felt colder than usual as he sat before the radio, the dim glow of the tubes casting long, flickering shadows on the walls. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the soft hum of the receiver. Jack leaned forward, his fingers hovering over the tuning knob, reluctant yet compelled to continue. Sarah's words lingered in his mind, but they felt distant now, drowned out by the enigmatic pull of the radio. It was as though the device was alive, whispering promises of answers he didn't even know he sought. When he finally turned the dial, the static came to life, interspersed with faint whispers. At first, they were unintelligible, but as Jack adjusted the frequency with trembling hands, they began to form words. "Jack, remember," the voice was chillingly familiar, and Jack's breath hitched. He leaned in closer, his heart pounding. "Who are you?" A burst of static drowned out the reply, followed by a low, mocking laugh. The sound seemed to echo through the room, sending shivers down his spine. Jack clenched his fists, his skepticism crumbling under the weight of his unease. As the voice faded, the basement light flickered, and the tools on his workbench rattled faintly. Jack froze, his gaze darting around the room. He was alone, or at least he thought he was. That night, the dreams returned. Images of his childhood home blurred with shadows, and faint whispers filled his ears. A woman's anguished voice cried out, but no matter how hard Jack tried to reach her, she always slipped away. When he woke, drenched in sweat, the whispers from the dream lingered in the back of his mind, merging with the haunting transmissions. The days blurred into nights as Jack became consumed by the radio. He documented each frequency, meticulously noting the cryptic messages that emerged. Sarah's visits to the basement grew less frequent. Her concern for him had turned into frustration. "You're scaring me, Jack," she said one evening, standing at the foot of the stairs. "This obsession isn't healthy." Jack didn't look up from his notebook, scribbling down another set of numbers. "I'm fine. I'm close to figuring this out, Sarah. Just trust me." "Trust you?" Sarah's voice cracked. "I don't even recognize you anymore. You're spending all your time down here chasing ghosts." "They're not ghosts," Jack snapped, finally meeting her eyes. There was a wildness in his expression that made Sarah step back. "You don't understand," he continued, his voice softer now, almost pleading. "They're trying to tell me something. Something about me. That's what I'm afraid of," Sarah murmured, tears welling in her eyes. That night, Jack heard the whispers even without the radio. They echoed through the house, faint and elusive, teasing the edges of his sanity. Objects began to move on their own. A picture frame fell from the mantel. The kitchen chairs were inexplicably rearranged. Jack's breaking point came when he found the message. Scrawled across the mirror in the bathroom, in what looked like condensation, were the words, "You know the truth." He staggered back, his reflection pale and gaunt. The whispers grew louder, and this time they weren't confined to words. They carried laughter, low, mocking, and cruel. Back in the basement, the radio blared to life on its own. The frequency was one Jack hadn't tuned to before, and the voice that emerged was sharper, clearer, dripping with malice. "Do you remember now, Jack?" The ghostly host's voice felt like needles piercing his mind. Images from his childhood began flooding back. Scenes of an old house, of locked doors and muffled cries. Jack clutched his head, the memories surfacing with brutal clarity. "No, stop," he whispered, sinking to his knees. But the voice was relentless. It spoke of his father's shadowed anger, of nights spent hiding under the bed, and of a room Jack had forced himself to forget. The basement began to tremble, as if the house itself was responding to the host's words. The radio emitted a high-pitched whine, and Jack could feel something pulling him closer, like invisible hands dragging him toward the device. "You can't run from the past," the host hissed. "You buried it, but it's still there, waiting," Jack screamed, slamming his fist against the radio. The room fell silent, save for his ragged breaths. He looked around, his eyes wild, but the shadows seemed deeper now, more alive. He stumbled up the stairs, locking the basement door behind him, but the whispers followed. They invaded his thoughts, weaving a web of doubt and fear. Jack knew he couldn't escape them, not until he uncovered the truth. And somewhere, deep down, he feared he already knew what that truth was. Jack's world had collapsed into a swirling abyss of static, numbers, and whispers. The radio had become his lifeline, his tormentor, his obsession. Days passed without sleep, the ticking of the clock unnoticed in the dim, oppressive glow of the basement. He scribbled furiously in his notebook, the pages filling with frantic notes and cryptic patterns as he struggled to decode the transmissions. The nightmares had grown worse. Each time Jack closed his eyes, he was plunged into suffocating darkness, where disjointed images flashed like a broken film reel. A child's laughter echoed, shrill and piercing, before morphing into agonized screams. He saw his younger self, hiding under a table, as shadowy figures loomed above. The dreams always ended the same way. Jack standing in front of a locked door, his trembling hand reaching for the knob as something clawed at the other side. When he woke, drenched in sweat, the whispers were there to greet him. "Why did you forget, Jack?" The voice taunted one night, its tone laced with venom. "Why did you run?" Jack slammed his fist onto the workbench, scattering tools and wires. "I didn't forget. I don't know what you're talking about." But he did know. Fragments of memories clawed their way to the surface, unbidden and jagged. The ghostly host's broadcasts grew more intrusive, blurring the line between waking and dreaming. The basement seemed to pulse with energy, the shadows crawling along the walls like living things. Sarah's presence in the house had become a distant echo, her once loving gaze now filled with despair. One evening, she stood in the doorway of the basement, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "Jack, please," she begged, her voice breaking. "This is destroying you. It's destroying us." "I'm so close, Sarah," Jack muttered without looking up, his voice hoarse. "I just need more time. I'm onto something big here. Something important." "Important," she snapped, stepping into the room. "You're losing your mind over this. You're barely sleeping, you're not eating, and you talk to that damn radio like it's alive." "It is alive," Jack shouted, his eyes blazing with an intensity that made Sarah take a step back. "You don't understand, Sarah. This is bigger than me, bigger than us. It's killing you," Sarah interrupted, her voice trembling. "And it's killing me to watch you like this." For a moment, Jack softened, his eyes darting to Sarah's tear-streaked face. But then the radio crackled to life, and the familiar voice cut through the tension. "Jack, she doesn't believe you, but we do." Sarah froze, her eyes wide with terror. "Did that thing just leave?" Jack growled, his focus snapping back to the radio. "I need to finish this. Jack, please," Sarah cried, reaching for him. "Leave," he roared, his voice echoing in the confined space. Sarah fled up the stairs, the sound of the basement door slamming reverberating in Jack's ears. For a brief moment, guilt clawed at him, but the voice on the radio soon drowned it out. "She doesn't understand," the ghostly host whispered, almost soothing now. "But you do. You've always known the truth. The truth." The word gnawed at Jack's sanity. What truth? What had he buried so deeply that even he couldn't remember? The ghostly host seemed to delight in tormenting him, dragging his darkest fears and regrets into the light. "Do you remember the basement, Jack? The other one?" The radio's glow seemed to intensify, bathing the room in an eerie, pulsating light. Jack's breathing quickened as the memories flooded back. A childhood basement, darker and colder than his own. The smell of damp earth. The sound of muffled voices behind a door he was forbidden to open. "What happened there, Jack?" the host hissed. "What did you see?" "I don't know," Jack screamed, clutching his head. "I don't remember." "Liar." The word hit him like a physical blow, and the room seemed to tilt, the walls closing in. Jack staggered back, his vision blurring as the ghostly host continued its assault. "You locked it away," the voice sneered. "You chose to forget, but we'll help you remember. We'll show you everything." The radio emitted a piercing shriek, and Jack collapsed to his knees, his hands pressed against his ears. The basement around him flickered, the shadows growing darker and more sinister. When the shrieking stopped, Jack found himself staring at the notebook on his workbench. The pages, once filled with his careful notes, were now covered in a language he didn't recognize. Jagged symbols and spiraling patterns that seemed to pulse with malevolence. The room fell silent, but Jack could feel the host's presence looming over him, waiting for him to crack. Above him, he heard Sarah sobbing, her cries muffled by the walls. Jack closed his eyes, the weight of his obsession threatening to crush him. And yet, he couldn't stop. He was too far gone. Jack sat alone in the basement, his trembling hands clutching the edge of the workbench. The radio sat before him, humming with a life of its own. The once familiar glow of its dials now seemed sinister, casting distorted shadows on the walls. Jack's mind was a storm of fragmented memories, twisted whispers, and the chilling voice of the ghostly host. "Tonight, Jack," the voice crackled, a menacing undertone seeping into its words. "Tonight, we finish this." Jack's throat tightened. "Finish what? What do you want from me?" "You already know," the host hissed. "You've always known. It's time to remember." The room dimmed, the air thick with a suffocating weight. Jack's breathing quickened as the shadows around him seemed to stretch, coiling like snakes. The radio's hum grew louder, and the voice commanded him with a dreadful certainty. "Turn the dial, Jack. Find the frequency of your truth." Compelled by a force he couldn't resist, Jack reached out, his hand trembling as it gripped the tuning knob. The static shifted and warped, giving way to faint cries and a chilling melody that sent shivers down his spine. And then he heard it. "Jack, do you remember?" The voice wasn't the host's. It was a child's voice, his voice. A rush of memories slammed into him with brutal clarity. He was 8 years old, hiding in the basement of his childhood home. His parents' muffled voices echoed above, tense and urgent. He remembered the fear, the feeling of abandonment, and the cold of the basement floor. But most of all, he remembered the door, the forbidden door. The memory shifted, and Jack saw himself as a child, walking toward the door despite his parents' warnings. He had heard the faint sound of crying from the other side, a voice that called his name. His hand reached for the doorknob. "Don't!" His mother's voice had screamed, pulling him away just as the door began to creak open. "What's behind the door, Jack?" The host's voice interrupted, dragging him back to the present. "You never found out, did you? But you've always wondered, always feared." Jack clenched his fists, his body trembling. "It doesn't matter," he spat. "It's in the past." "Is it?" The host taunted, its voice a cacophony of mocking laughter. "The past is alive, Jack. It's here with us, with you. Face it." The radio emitted a low, vibrating hum, and the room around Jack began to shift. The walls of his basement melted away, replaced by the dark, damp confines of his childhood basement. The door loomed before him, larger and more menacing than he remembered. Jack stumbled back, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "This isn't real," he whispered. "This can't be real." "But it is," the host whispered, its voice dripping with malice. "Open the door, Jack. Face what you've buried." Jack's heart pounded as he approached the door, the cries from behind it growing louder. His hand hovered over the doorknob, his mind screaming at him to stop. But he couldn't. Not anymore. With a trembling breath, Jack turned the knob. The door creaked open, revealing a dark, empty void. The cries stopped abruptly, replaced by an overwhelming silence. Jack stepped inside, his surroundings fading into nothingness. And then he saw it. A mirror. In the mirror's cracked surface, Jack saw his reflection, distorted and haunted. The reflection spoke, its voice overlapping with the host's. "You've always been afraid, Jack. Afraid of the truth. Afraid of yourself." "No," Jack whispered, shaking his head. "I'm not afraid anymore." The reflection smiled, a twisted, eerie grin. "Prove it." Jack clenched his fists, his resolve hardening. "You're just a voice, a shadow of my past. You don't control me." The reflection began to shatter, pieces of glass falling away to reveal darkness beyond. The voice of the host screamed, its power waning as Jack stood his ground. "I'm done with you," Jack said, his voice steady. "I'm done running." The void began to collapse, the radio's hum turning into a deafening roar. Jack reached out, pulling himself free from the shadowy realm and slamming his hand onto the radio's power switch. The basement fell silent. Jack sank to the floor, his body trembling as tears streamed down his face. The weight that had pressed on him for so long was gone, replaced by a hollow ache. Weeks passed, and Jack began the slow process of rebuilding his life. The radio was gone, dismantled and buried far away, but its impact lingered. Jack couldn't deny the changes in himself. He felt older, more weathered, but also lighter, as though he had shed a burden he'd carried his entire life. Sarah returned cautiously, her love and patience offering him a lifeline. It wasn't easy. The scars left by the ghostly host ran deep, but together, they began to heal. One evening, as they sat together on the porch, Sarah took Jack's hand. "Do you think it's really over?" she asked softly. Jack looked at her, his gaze steady. "I don't know, but I do know this. I'm not afraid anymore." And for the first time in what felt like forever, Jack allowed himself to hope. Thank you for watching this video. I hope you liked our video. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, like our video, and share your thoughts with us in the comments.